Bienvenue, bem-vindos, bienvenidos. Welcome to the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Series. O meu nome é Angélica Galante e eu sou professora de ensino de línguas na Universidade McGill e diretora do Laboratório Plurilingue aqui na McGill University. I've just introduced myself in my mother tongue, Portuguese. My name is Angélica Galante. I am an assistant professor in language education at McGill University and director of the Plurilingual Lab, which hosts this speaker series. I would like to begin by showing my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the 5 student volunteers who worked really hard this past year to make this speaker series a success. They are now enjoying some much-deserved vacation, and I would like to thank Paul Megan Shiblo, Ben Kalman, Xinyan Fang, Li Peng, and Aisha Barise. I would also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Susan Ballinger, who is here today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marianne Turner. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks the territory of Turtle Island, also known as Canada, where peoples of the world now gather. It is important to recognize and acknowledge the detrimental effects that colonialism has had on Indigenous peoples to this day, and how we can commit to support the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. I live in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, which is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. I acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this land, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. I would like to invite you to acknowledge the lands of the Indigenous peoples where you are today, and if you'd like, you can include this in the chat. I would also like to invite you to think about our commitment to respect, support, and advance the traditions, languages, and cultures of the Indigenous peoples around the world, and the actions that we can take as part of reconciliation efforts. I would like to invite my dear colleague, Dr. Susan Ballinger, to introduce Marianne Turner.
Thanks very much, Angelica. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Turner, and I was so pleased when she agreed to give a talk for the Plurilingual Lab. As you have probably seen, you probably read her bio, so I'm going to just add a few things from my perspective about Dr. Turner, who is a senior lecturer at Monash University. One of the things that she writes about in her bio is that her research focuses on context-sensitive approaches to the integration of content and language. Now, I've gotten to understand that better over time and in reading her publications, and more recently in working with her on with a book chapter that she sent into a book that I'm co-editing with some colleagues. And I really can say that I so much appreciate several things about her work. One is that it addresses this really central question, which I'm going to take from her book, and I'll give a little plug for you, although I probably can't see it because I've got it on blur, but it's titled Multilingualism as a Resource and a Goal, Using and Learning Languages in Mainstream Schools. An essential question in her research is, how do we promote multilingualism in mainstream schools where the pursuit of another language may be considered a benefit, but not a priority in wider society, and heritage language attrition is common? And she's doing this, she's pursuing this question, as I said, in this very like context situated way. Her work with teachers is also very much situated in their realities, and that's something I really appreciate about her work, and something I've really learned from her. So I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk, and I hope you will all appreciate it as much as I know I will. Thank you. And Angelica is just going to go over some of the Zoom etiquette now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. So before we begin, just some Zoom etiquette. Remember that during the talk, please keep your video and sound off. You can have the reaction clapping or saying thumbs up if you'd like. The talk is being recorded right now, and is going to be available in the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel. We are going to have about 30-minute discussion time after the talk. You are welcome to post your questions in the chat, and you can unmute your microphone as well to ask questions, but only in the end of the talk. I'm going to be moderating the discussion, and I think that's about it. So we can get started. So I'm going to ask everybody now to turn your video and sound off. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it on to Dr. Turner.
Okay, I'll just set up. Can I just first start by saying thank you so much, Susan, for that amazing introduction. And it sets the scene very much for the context that I'm going to give you. So thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, Angelica, too, and for the invitation. I will just share the screen now. Okay, can everybody see that? Is that clear?
Yes, it's clear.
Yes. Great, thank you. So I will be talking about promoting multiliteracies through translanguaging pedagogy today, and I would also like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm sitting or I'm speaking to you today and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to specifically acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, who are the ongoing custodians of the land on which Monash University now stands, and I'm also now sitting in my home today. We pay our respects through our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. Okay, I should also say that it's 7 o'clock in Melbourne. I'm talking to you from Melbourne, Australia, and hopefully I will, if I start slow, I will gather a bit of steam as I go on. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you today about is what I work with, and as Susan said, I think a lot about teachers and what teachers are doing at home, at home, I will. What teachers are doing at school, not what they're doing at home, and try to work out how to transmit what we're doing in scholarship and all of these amazing ideas that are coming out in scholarship, and how do we get that into the classroom in my particular context. So I'll talk about the development of linguistic repertoire in that sense, and I do use translanguaging in my research as an umbrella concept, and I'll explain that. And then I will talk about the relationship between translanguaging pedagogy, multimodality, multiliteracies that I work with in my research. And I will have a special focus on home language literacies because of the big focus of this presentation, in particular on language attrition in Australia and trying to maintain home languages. So this is the subtext of a lot of what I will be talking about today, is thinking, how do we keep students speaking their own languages, reading and writing their own languages at home, and how can schools help with that? I'll explain the Australian context because it is important to my research, and also it's quite nuanced, and I'll explain it so you can see if it resonates with your context, if there's anything that is similar or take away, but you need to really know where all of this is coming from and how it fits with schools, basically. Then I'll give an example of a study that I'm doing. It's funded by the department here in Victoria, Australia, and the significance of thinking about multiliteracies in relation to translanguaging pedagogy. Okay, so to start with, I will talk about my theoretical perspective, what I work with. So what I try to do is I think of translanguaging as a majority theory, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And as I will keep saying throughout the presentation, the way that I think about theory and theory building has so much to do with context and how I think that context can help drive theory forward. So I'm hoping that people have heard the word translanguaging before. It's quite a common one in scholarship these days. I'm not going to go into too much detail about translanguaging and shuttling between named languages, this kind of idea of translanguaging. I am thinking about it as a theoretical perspective. And as a theoretical perspective, I would say one of the main ideas is addressing deficit views of non-standardized ways of communicating. So trying to ensure that people understand the sophisticated ways of speaking that people who have historically, or the way that they speak is not considered right or proper, that it's sophisticated and it's really worth something, and affirming that. So that's the bottom line of how I work with translanguaging. I think of it as meaning making in a holistic sense. But what I try to do is push it a little bit more so that it's more inclusive of people who understand themselves to be monolingual. And I hope that this will become clear why I'm doing this. Will become clear in the presentation because of the context in which I'm working. Because it's a grey area between people who think they're monolingual. They might actually be heritage speakers who have moved away from their languages at home. So I've taken this quotation to try and explain this from Ofelia Garcia. So where she says the translanguaging is the multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds. So I'm taking that idea of bilinguals, which is shorthand for multilinguals as well, and expanding it. So thinking about this particular understanding of translanguaging as the center. So bilingual, multilinguals are the norm. Okay, and I really like this quotation by Berthelot here. He's talking about multilingualism, but I think it fits very well with this way of thinking about language as multilingualism as extraordinary. So he says multilingualism as a field of inquiry is the investigation of an ordinary phenomenon. What is special about multilingualism is that multilingual speakers may have an extraordinary amount of language and language variability at their disposal. So the way that I think about translanguaging is that you put bi-multilingualism is positioned as the norm, it's the center, but that doesn't exclude monolingualism. It's more putting monolingualism at the periphery rather than the center. So the way that we normally or traditionally have thought about it is when people learn languages or they speak other languages, then they're learning to be monolingual in that language and that's the standard. But instead of thinking like that, putting bi-multilingualism in the center and thinking about that monolingual ideal as a periphery. But it does mean that the translanguaging includes the idea of monolingualism because language variation happens within one language as well. So it can be associated with one named language or different named languages. So this is what I work with. So translanguaging as a majority theory, thinking about it as a theoretical perspective on language that places this idea of busting up, just trying to explode deficit views of standardized ways of communicating, but thinking about language in a holistic way. And also the way that I work with translanguaging is not only thinking about leveraging students' linguistic repertoire for their learning, but increasing it as well. And that's not only increasing students' linguistic repertoire with the standardized language at school, but everything. So if you think of the linguistic repertoire as an end in itself, then that means that teaching languages at school is a really good idea because it helps build linguistic repertoire as a whole. So you can harness the social category of named languages as a means to this end. And also, what kids or people are speaking at home, they often think of as a named language as well, and they think of it as bounded. People's perceptions are very important with this too. But this is what I try to think, how can we help just increase linguistic repertoire? And that means everything that people have. So the ways that this can be done is through leveraging home, school, community languages. Okay, so broadening out what we think about how we're teaching students language. And these are pedagogical goals, which I've used in my research quite a bit. So translanguaging pedagogical goals, the kinds of things, if we're thinking about increasing students' linguistic repertoire, what's the purpose of that? So translanguaging fits quite nicely with this because it is thinking about language in a holistic way. So helping students co-construct knowledge and display it with what they have, with the linguistic resources that they have. Promoting metalinguistic and cross-linguistic awareness. So again, this is tapping into the way that we do think about language as, we have a shorthand way of understanding language. Well, this is Korean, this is Vietnamese. It's just a quick way for us to understand rather big differences often between languages. And so that's what cross-linguistic awareness can can relate to. Affirming multilingual identities should probably be first. That's become third here, but it's so, I don't know, in my own research with schools, it's just number one. It's something that, you know, it's so lovely, kids just coming to life when people actually affirm their knowledge and their linguistic knowledge as part of their knowledge base, and knowing something important, knowing something valuable is just so wonderful, watching kids come to life. And the last one, of course, supports social justice and critical reflection on language inequality. So these are the goals that I work with. And I also think about this quite a bit. So with translanguaging, there has been a few critiques, maybe around, you know, context, which which I'm trying to talk about, and also this one, which I find really, really interesting because I see it. I understand it well from the on the ground kind of perspective. So there has been a critique of translanguaging that aims to be transformative, to disrupt linguistic hierarchies, to focus on this kind of language sophistication without being trapped by thinking that standardized language is the only kind of language that's important. But then the way that it can be used in schools is that it can be used as a scaffolding tool to lead students towards standardized language. So there's a problem there. There's a bit of a tension there with translanguaging. And I do see that translanguaging, often in the literature as well, it is tied to TESOL spaces, for example, teaching English to speakers of other languages. It doesn't necessarily go into mainstream spaces, and this is one of the reasons too why I try to think of translanguaging as a majority theory, to try to help it be about language in general, so then multilingual people can be at the center, and then the disruption might start to, you know, you can start trying to disrupt the linguistic hierarchies if people don't know what they don't know. And this often happens with monolingualism. If people haven't learned other languages or don't speak them, it's very difficult for them to understand certain things. So including them in a conversation, I think, is very important. And one of the things that I will be talking about, you know, in this presentation is trying to move beyond the scaffolding idea in translanguaging and the way that we use translanguaging pedagogy. And one way to do this, or what we've been working with, is multimodality. And this is established that it aligns with translanguaging pedagogy. So this is from Garcia and Lee here. So when they're talking about translanguaging, they include a trans-semiotic system. They think about translanguaging as linguistic, you know, but there is, you know, the person's semiotic repertoire fits well with this way of thinking. And multimodality complements the goals of translanguaging pedagogy, as been seen in different kinds of literature. So this is probably not anything that you don't know, but I just thought it was worth saying with multimodality, just giving some common modes that are often worked with in school. Written, spoken, visual, audio is, you know, music and noises and this kind of thing for meaning making. Spatial is how things are organized, and gestural, what I'm doing now with my hands. And the way that we think about multimodality in schools in Australia, a lot, this has been very influential, this idea of multiliteracies, is through trying to increase students' capacity for, you know, different kinds of modes and understanding different kinds of modes. And this idea of multiliteracies was coined by the New London group in the mid-90s. And they were thinking of it as this, as meaningful participation in communities and societies in general rests on being able to work with a range of texts that rely on different semiotic modes, as well as linguistic register languages, dialects. So the multiliteracies, it refers to the capacity to navigate the variability of meaning making in different cultural, social, or domain-specific contexts, and how that meaning is made in ways that are increasingly multimodal. So what's very nice about this, I think, is that they have really included linguistic and cultural diversity. So they're talking about multimodality and trying to increase the capacity of students to work with multimodality, but they are underpinning that with linguistic and cultural diversity. The only problem is that sometimes it can get lost. So multiliteracies have been very influential, but the multimodality aspect tends to be highlighted over the linguistic diversity aspect. So this is when, you know, English, for example, in Australia is very taken for granted in the school system, that other languages kind of, they become less visible in the multiliteracies, and it can be a bit easier for teachers to just focus on the multimodality. So linguistic and cultural differences are certainly an important aspect of multiliteracies, but research has not sufficiently addressed them. I think we can do a lot more with this. And also to remember, and this is what I'm really talking about, is to remember that home language literacies does fit under this idea of multiliteracies. And this does still include traditional idea of literacy, just reading and writing. And reading and writing can be a fragile skill at home because it's not necessarily a part of daily communication. This can also be said of oral traditions if students or kids are just not getting exposure to it in their everyday lives. So I'm working from the assumption that being denied the chance to develop literature in the minority language they speak can deprive bilingual and multilingual students of rich opportunities and resources. So this is really the bottom line of what I'm talking about today. So people do work with trying to work out how do you support home language literacies, and it has been recognised, acknowledged that we can't really leave it to be the sole responsibility of parents. It's not really fair to do that, and it doesn't take into account inequities amongst parents. But some parents, it's harder for them to help, but also it doesn't take into account what parents think about what they have. So this deficit messaging, that, it's not important to speak the home language, or it's not important to read and write the home language, it affects parents as much as it affects kids. And this is something that I see. It's not only with people from disadvantaged backgrounds, it's people also from very educated backgrounds who think that they should be speaking English to their kids, and they should be getting their kids to read and write in English. And why would you teach tell them the home language? Because it can be a bit of a struggle to do it, and they're not really sure why. And the reading and writing can be the thing that drops off first before the oral communication. So this is something that it's important that schools can help here. And people have designed some wonderful resources, so the Canadian ones as well here, that we use with schools, with teachers. So I've put them here because they're so good. The ScriptJab is great too, because it's wonderful. This is what we're doing too, is trying to get the kids to create their own bilingual texts. And so this is really, really nice resource as well to show, kids how they can do that. Okay, so now that we're going to Australia. So this is us coming to Australia now. This is a road going to Garryword, which is otherwise known as the Grampians in Victoria. It's one of my favourite places in Victoria. And I am going to, as I warned, I am going to talk a little bit about Australian context, so you can see how similar or how different it is to your contexts. This is very wordy. I've got lots and lots of words on this slide, but I'll explain what's here. So this is a fact sheet. It's taken from a fact sheet from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and this is the last one. So what I really want to show you is the way in Australia languages are positioned. And so you can see it at the bottom of this document. It says, a nation of nations that continues to flourish. Okay, so we come from almost everywhere on the planet, from nearly 200 countries in the world, more than 1 in 4 of us born overseas, 300 languages spoken in our homes. The Indigenous element is missing here, and it's glaringly missing. But you can see that there is a celebration of, oh, we're so multilingual, it's so wonderful. If you look at the top, and I'll say where, if you look at the first bit though, there's something hidden here, and it's not really, it doesn't jump out and get you, because of the celebratory language. But if you look at the second paragraph down, it says, moreover, less than half our overseas born population spoke only English at home. So that means that more than half spoke another language at home. Yeah, more than half. So it's very strange language, and it also doesn't correlate with the language in the sentence below. For those of us born in Australia, 1 in 12 spoke a language other than English at home. So if you think about it, then okay, so more than half drops to 1 in 12 with the next generation. So you can see the attrition rate there, but they're just not necessarily, they're putting it there, but they're not necessarily drawing attention to that. So we're celebrating it, but we're letting it go. And you can see from the census questions, so these are the census questions that we all answer for language. And here, does the person use a language other than English at home? Mark 1 box only. Okay, so there goes multilingualism. So people have to mark 1, and people need to put the one that they use the most often. And also there's a prompt there. So it might be tempting, for example, if people speak languages that they think nobody's really going to understand or know what they are, they might just go, oh yeah, I speak Arabic too, so I'll just tick the Arabic box. I won't tick I won't say Syrian, I'll say Arabic because I know Arabic too. And then how well does the person speak English? Another thing too about the language is the literacy. The reading and writing in the language gets lost. So they've changed the wording to use, which was really nice, to include the sign language. But it was to include sign language. It wasn't to include reading and writing. So I think that this sums it up quite nicely. I quite like there's a little element of frustration here that I thought was good, because in my own work it can be a bit frustrating that it's not a priority for people, and languages and home languages are not necessarily a priority. So this comes from an oral, from a presentation by John Hajek, who works at Melbourne University. There's the Anglobubble, and he's referring to Australia, is that part of the world where the concentration of monolingual English speakers that operates in English thinks it's only natural that everything should happen, be experienced and understood only in English, and that, of course, logically, everyone speaks English. In their minds, that is the reality, despite any evidence to the contrary. In the Anglobubble, everyone speaks English because the experience of many of its L1 English residents seems to show them, with little or no introspection or investigation, that everyone speaks or should speak English. So this is slightly, I think it's really good to put this against the societal celebration of other languages, because this can be the reality of when you are trying to engage with other languages on the ground. So if we go to schools, there is a lot of linguistic diversity, and this is actually, because of the language attrition, there's a huge range of what people could do with language at home as well. So English as an additional language learners are often what people understand, or people work with the most easily. Oh, okay, well you don't understand enough English, so we can help you with your English. The community exposure to other languages, so the students who do speak English and are fine with English but have exposure to other languages at home, that's a much less known group by teachers. And then, of course, there is language at school that they can use for learning. So students are learning language at school. And this is something that I try to think about too, in terms of including monolingual students, that they are learning a language at school, and there can be ways to help them want to learn language at school. So that's the societal, the way that we approach language in Australia. And now institutionally, going to the institutional level of the Department of Education and Training in Victoria. So each state is governed differently. So I'm working with Victoria, and Victoria is quite, advanced in this way. So Victoria has a reputation in Australia of thinking about languages more than other states in Australia. So what we have now in Victoria is a new, relatively new English as an additional language curriculum. And what the department has tried to do is engage with scholarship and engage with ideas that are coming from around the world. And so we have the idea of plurilingualism in the curriculum. So they have adopted the idea of plurilingualism, and I'm very happy to work with plurilingualism as well. So what I do when I'm talking to teachers, because I don't want to confuse them, I just want to, ensure that what they do in the classroom is that they are using and leveraging languages for students learning. I don't use the word translanguaging. I think of that as a theoretical perspective, and I work with the term plurilingualism and plurilingual. So here is the way that they see plurilingualism in the curriculum and the way that they introduce it to teachers. The ability of a person who has competence in more than one language to switch between them when necessary for ease of communication and learning. It is the interconnected knowledge of multiple languages. It takes an individual person as the point of departure. So that's the messaging that the teachers are getting. If they read this, hopefully they do. And again, this is to show the institutional context of Australia and how plurilingualism is being brought in to the curriculum documents. So this example is taken from years 3 to 8 for writing from the EAL curriculum. And we think about this as Bs. So the students come in at BL, which is when they don't speak very much English at all. And then they go to B3, and that's when they transition to the English curriculum. So this is a level B2. But the reason that I want to show this to you is to show you that there is a huge scaffolding element in the plurilingual strategies. And this is understandable because it's an EAL curriculum. So they're thinking, well, we're teaching the kids English. How can we do that? Oh, we can use their home languages to help teach them English. So this is a really good thing. It's bringing it in for the first time. This is very new to Australia, but there's a scaffolding element there. So the first one, share ideas and feedback in home languages, that's a really good one. That's not necessarily scaffolding, but the other ones down there, when it talks about unknown words, it's unknown words in English, and use knowledge of written or spoken home language text to form new English texts, plan before writing in English. So it's a scaffolding idea there. On the right-hand side of the slide, with the achievement standards, I won't read through these. This is just for you to have a look at. But the main reason I've put them there is to show you that the teachers don't need to engage with the plurilingual strategies in order to meet the achievement standards. The achievement standards have no plurilingualism in them. So this is where we're at. We're at this situation where, okay, so the plurilingualism has entered the curriculum. Institutionally, it's recognised that it's a good idea to bring home languages into the classroom, but teachers don't necessarily have to engage with it if they don't feel comfortable with it. And in terms of multimodality, EAL and D stands for dialect here. Engage in, so that they are trying to engage EALD learners in multimodality and show that multimodality fits with these learners very well too. So again, it's a scaffolding idea. So if you look at the two last sentences, most EALD learners can confidently create content using familiar digital tools. This can be used as a platform to expand their use of language in combination with other modes of communication. Now, when they're talking about expand their use of language, the interesting thing in Australia is that, English is so taken for granted that when people talk about language, they tend to be talking about English, but it does give us room to move and room to think about language in a more holistic sense. So what I find that I'm doing with teachers in terms of language orientation, I find that I'm trying to help them think beyond supportive. So we have gone beyond assimilative, and this is what I've been trying to show with this. So we do understand that home languages are a good thing in Australia. They are not a bad thing. They are a good thing. We acknowledge them. We say, for example, the department has a web page saying to parents, speak to your children in the language you know best. So they do really promote this idea of home languages that don't speak to them in English. So what we're doing is we're trying to move from supportive to inclusive. And in the inclusive, it's the idea of promoting home languages and multilingualism more openly in class, bringing home languages and literacies into the classroom, and inviting families to share language and literacy. So that's what we're trying to do and trying to help teachers with. And in the research that I've done in this space, when I've been thinking about leveraging languages as a resource for learning, I have found that teachers they don't find it too hard to affirm and value multilingual identities. In fact, they really enjoy doing it, in my experience. And it's been wonderful to see that teachers so often, and I've got to say that I have been working in the primary space, and these teachers really like their kids. You know, they want to know who their kids are, and they have these extra tools and these extra strategies for knowing more about their kids. They embrace it. And this is what I found in my research. And obviously I'm not talking about everyone, because the teachers in my research are the ones who are, you know, willing to bring other languages into the class. But this does seem to be the easiest goal, if you like, if you think about translanguaging pedagogical goals. The next one is they find a bit harder. And I say general learning and instruction because I think that the meta-linguistic and cross-linguistic awareness can actually be embedded in the general learning and instruction. So often they can think of using home languages as a way to meet English, the achievement standards in the English curriculum, which can be more about language awareness. This can be more difficult for them, and they have had success with this. They've done well, but it's not as intuitive for them as the affirming and valuing multilingual identities. And I try to do a lot of work with them in this space. The reflecting critically on languages is even harder. It's the one that comes, it's the most difficult one. What we've been doing, or I've been doing in my research, is thinking about disrupting linguistic hierarchies by ensuring that other languages are being used, so it's not a completely monolingual environment, and also flipping so that the bi-multilingual students, they have something of value. It's valued in the class, and so that the monolingual students are not, you know, it's just a change in the dynamic, and they feel it. The bilingual students, when they feel proud of what they know, they do feel like they have something that other people might not have. So it's really in the doing, with the reflecting critically on language, rather than being very, very explicit about it at this stage. So it's kind of slow steps towards reflecting critically on language in an explicit way. And this is taken from my book, because this is sort of the way that I think about working in schools and working with opportunities to learn, or to leverage language to increase students' linguistic repertoire. That it's not just a matter of going in and upskilling the teachers in you know, okay, well, just home languages are good, use them in class. There are different things going on that need to be considered. And the multilingual stance part this is what I think of with teachers. So how are the teachers approaching bringing other languages into the classroom, home languages into the classroom? One of the main issues in this stance is teacher disposition. So really, I would say that at least the teachers I work with, they think that it's wonderful that the kids are speaking another language at home. They think it's great. They don't have a pro-monolingual stance, but sometimes whether or not they are open to not understanding everything in their classroom is a really, really big point. It's a big aspect of multilingual stance. So I include in multilingual stance their openness to having languages in the classes that they don't necessarily share. And teachers can struggle with this. The teachers who are the most successful with bringing these kinds of plurilingual strategies into the classroom are the ones who are willing to, you know, the students teach them. So they are willing to say, okay, well, you teach me about that. And they're willing to not be able to control everything in the classroom. And they're not afraid, you know, oh, maybe a student will laugh at me in their own language, or maybe a student will laugh at you in English as well. But they know these kinds of things, and they're happy to play. but some teachers can get quite anxious with that. The student engagement with language is also very important because there's such a range of engagement, and this is something that I'm going to talk about when I'm talking about the study. Engagement is what students do with language, the language practices they have, but the other thing is how they feel about it. And teachers can't take for granted that students just want their home languages in the classroom. One of the issues is that we have community schools in Melbourne, and they can be great. You know, my kids go to a Spanish one because their father's Spanish, and it's just brilliant. The teacher is just absolutely wonderful. But sometimes what happens in these community schools is that they can be very demotivational. So the kids don't like them, and they've been forced to speak their language in these schools, and they see it as some kind of penance, and then they get cross, you know, oh, seriously, we have to do this at school as well, you know, which is a real shame. So the teacher needs to know how the students are engaging with their language and not just assume anything. So getting to know their students' language practices and how they feel about them is a really important part of the process before bringing in the plurilingual strategies. And the last one is the institutional structures and pedagogies is obviously very important too. So how much in schools collaboration is occurring, how much school leadership is behind what the teacher is doing, and how that can be increased, and how much also it's possible to work with language teachers and how comfortable they are with that, with being involved in plurilingual strategies, and whether or not schools have what we call multicultural education aides who are there to help with translation, help with liaising with parents, this kind of thing. And I'll talk more about them later on too. Oh, okay, so now I will talk about a project that I've been involved with to show really how multiliteracies can be promoted through translanguaging pedagogy. I realised too, it would be good to keep the same terminology, but because I have this translanguaging umbrella in my mind, this is why I say translanguaging, and also the translanguaging pedagogical goals in the literature is what I've been using. But the teachers and the department go with the plurilingual idea, and we don't want to confuse them on the ground. So the project is called Learning Through Languages, Plurilingual Pedagogy in the English Classroom, and we're leading teachers towards that. And my fellow investigators are Anne Curie and Katrina. I work with them in this, and it's funded by the Department of Education and Training in Victoria. So the reason, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the project, because what I really would like to do is show you examples of how home language literacies in particular can be promoted under the umbrella of multiliteracies in the classroom. So this is the study that we're involved with. So it's design-based framework. This is the overarching instructional hypothesis that the generation of bi-multilingual texts can meet learning objectives in primary English classrooms. So we are, working towards these texts, these bi-multilingual texts, and they are multimodal, and we're also trying to help the teachers make them digital if they're comfortable with that. So we've been working with 7 primary school teachers from 5 Victorian government schools. There's a professional learning component as well. So we have, the teachers learn about these strategies. They go back, they teach a sequence of lessons, we support them throughout. And we look at the lesson plans, students' work samples, reflections, and also we've had a group interview with teachers. So what I was saying before was that getting to know students' language practices is such an important part of the process, and we realised that we need to show teachers this do it first, and then you can, leverage what you learn about this. And what we've also learned is that different kinds of activities give different kinds of information for the teachers as to whether, reading and writing is something that students do at home. So language portraits is a lovely way of beginning. So this is Bush, where we're from 2006 as well as 2010 here. And this is what students have done in the project. And it's a lovely beginning point because it shows how they feel about their language practices as well. So, for example, on the left, what's really interesting, and also on the right too, that you can see very clearly that English is still outside the body. There's a lot of exposure to English, but it hasn't really got in there yet. That Arabic from Iraq is inside, it's well known. The Syrian is the language of the heart, and French is the language of the digestive system. But I think you can see with the French that I think the Arabic, the student is more comfortable with Arabic than French, but there is a big chunk of French in there. So it's a really nice visual of the language practices there. And I've just included the one on the right because I'm not sure how easy it is to read this, but the student or the kid is showing so much language awareness in a way. So not just grouping things by named languages, but also by what they do with the language. So there's gaming English and there's English Arabic. So it's like when I speak English and Arabic together, you know, and then there's just English, and then Arabic is also divided up. And there seem to be lots of hearts, which is really nice too. So that's a very nice initial, we found, it's an initial activity, not necessarily the only one that you would do with the students. So it's something else that adds to this by showing the context of use, so who the students are using language with and where they're using language. These language maps are really useful for collecting that information. So again, what's nice about the one on the left, there's Moroccan Arabic, Lebanese Arabic, so different kinds of Arabic, and it looks like that's also influenced the thinking around English, so American English, Australian English. So they're thinking in terms of language variety as well, that student, which is very interesting. So these language maps are quite similar to each other, but they can take lots and lots of different forms, and students can get quite creative with them. So both of those, though, don't give information to the teachers about how much the students are reading and writing their language at home. The language maps can, because what can happen with the language maps is that kids who do read and write their languages at home can put the language on the language map, and then it becomes clear that they are literate in the language. But generally, from what I've seen, and I've done quite a few language maps over the years with students, with teachers and students now, generally students don't choose to write in different languages. They might write one or two words, but they have written in English, so that it is hard to see. So one teacher recently, she had a feeling, she thought maybe her kids didn't read and write home languages, and so this was the main catalyst for the survey that she created, this survey here, and she did find through the survey that she was correct, and the students were not confident with reading and writing in their home language, and that really she used that to inform the activities that she decided to do in the class. But the really nice thing was that she didn't decide to just back off from anything that involved home language literacy practices. She decided to support it, and that had has a lot to do with the project, because that's what we're trying to do with them. As you saw, the instructional hypothesis was the creation of a text, which usually, you know, you think, oh, maybe there should be some writing in the text. It's not only oral. We have given the option that the students can just do the oral, so they can write in English and then they have the oral component in their language. But we think in a highly literate way. I think teachers do as well, because we're so used to working with literacy. So, which is nice, I think, because it means that, you know, this teacher, for example, was thinking, okay, so how can I support home language literacy practices in order to bring them into the classroom? And so she had access to multilingual education aids, and they spoke Arabic, Somali, and Vietnamese, and so they covered quite a few languages, well, the main languages spoken in her group. So she had the MEAs come in to, when she says to each of the three groups, that was, she divided them by language proficiency in English, not by language groups. So she didn't just say Arabic, Somali, Vietnamese. She brought them all together to look at what each other was doing. So they saw more languages than they spoke at home. So she had one of the MEAs come into each of the 3 groups, and with our shared text, I got them to write their language underneath, and they showed us where the different parts of the sentence were. That was probably the best things we've done so far, because it was a fabulous chance for them to talk about how things work in different languages. So it was a noticing activity, like thinking about, cross-linguistic awareness and analysis. And what was really nice about this too, and this was the feedback that the teacher gave about the MEA, that they came to life. They were so happy because they had a more active role in the classroom. Often what happens to MEAs is their role is to sit next to a student and translate or interpret for them. So this gave more agency to the MEA, and also showed the students that their language, which they shared with the MEAs, that was being promoted and affirmed in the classroom. So that was a whole class approach. But also the MEAs were used for liaising with families and providing students with individualised support. And this could also mean the promotion of home language literacy practices and helping English too at the same time. So this is a really nice quotation, I think, to show this. But one of my students said, "I can't read Arabic, miss." I said, "But surely you can talk to your parents." "In what language?" She said, "Assyrian, but I can't write." I said, "That's okay. You can always use your spoken language at home, and we can always ask the MEA to help to translate into Arabic." In the end, she was the only one who had every single page translated in Arabic and English, and her sentence structures in English just improved so much. So this was, again, giving a greater role to the MEA. So the MEAs are often just thought, okay, well, it's that language whenever we just need something to be translated directly. But this was giving a meaning-making role to the MEA, and it helped the student with their English as well as helping them with Arabic, which they didn't know. So it's a bit more complex, this idea of home language practices too, because these students, and a lot of them were Assyrian, their reading and writing was in Arabic, and they were speaking in Assyrian. And so these kinds of things, it was really good for the teacher to learn as well. So the MEAs were found to support home language literacy practices a lot, and teachers' ability to bring them into the class. Parents did as well. So parents at home, teachers were trying to, include the parents in information and help their kids at home with things that the kids needed to write. So with the bilingual texts, the parents could help the kids at home with those. The Google Translate was also very useful, and in terms of, if we think about the disposition of teachers, the multilingual stance, the ability of, do we want to have something in class that we don't understand? Google Translate was really good for this. It gave them something to hold on to. So it was a point of departure. It was a blunt instrument, because Google Translate, it's not quite there yet in terms of getting it all right. But it was really a really nice tool for the teachers, and they talked about it a lot. So, for example, this teacher, I've been taking a sentence out of that text that was easy to work out between me and Google Translate, and I've written them on sentence strips, and then we've had a look at the other language. We've moved the English around to match where those parts are in the text from the other language. So she had more confidence doing that because of Google Translate. The other thing that was really good about promoting home language literacy practices through Google Translate was the sound function. So the multimodality of the tool, really, because the students were learning more about reading and writing in their language because they could hear it as well. So when they were writing it down, they could hear whether it was correct. Unfortunately, not all the languages had sound functions, so Somali didn't, for example, but hopefully the Google Translate will continue to evolve. But it was useful for other languages in the classroom. Just an example of an autobiographical text that a teacher had. So this is with Arabic, and it's interesting here that the English is typed, but the Arabic isn't. So that shows that maybe there isn't so much emphasis being put on learning to read and write Arabic at home, because the computer doesn't have the necessary equipment to write it on the computer. And here we have a, these are practice translation texts. So this is kind of warming up for the bilingual books that the teacher was going to do with the students. And why I wanted to show you this is the range, to show the range of the home language literacy practices. So you can see on the left, you can see the Arabic there, so the students are speaking in English and then in their own language too, or their home language. In the one at the top, you can see that it's been, the Vietnamese has been transliterated into English, so the Vietnamese script is not known by the student. And then for the last one, the dog was chasing the cat, it's oral Vietnamese, but not written at all. So there was a range of what students were able to do, but the oral function was really nice. So the home language was included, and it was the literacy practices were being promoted in the class. So what happened often was that students go home and say that they want to learn, you know, it's something they're doing at school, they're interested in it, and it just helps out the parents if the parents need a little bit of extra help and support to prioritise that at home. Okay, so this is the examples of the bilingual texts that the teachers did with the students, what the students produced. And what I'd like to do is just, so you give it to you to listen to and then just to talk about it.
Eid by Siddiq. Allahu Akbar. Allah is the greatest. Muslim people celebrate Eid when they see the new moon at the start of Sha'ad after Ramadan. Muslimiinta waxay u dabaaldegaan ciida markay arkaan bisha cusub bilowga Sha'ad kadib Ramadaanka. People get clothes and people get presents. Dadka dhar bay helaan, dadkuna hadiyad ayay helaan.
Yeah, I'll stop there. So what I really wanted to draw your attention to here is the transliteration of the Arabic. So it's that, you know, the stages of learning the language and the ability to still bring in the home language literacy practices, even if the kids don't know the script. The other thing that is really nice is that you can hear that the student is, when they're reading the Arabic, they're very, you know, they know that the spoken, but they're learning as they go. So it's not just learning the English. Another thing that we're doing with the teachers, another step that we're doing, is trying to help them work out with the kids. They tend to put the English first and then they put the home language, and we're working out whether there are different ways of doing that. So not always prioritising the English, but swapping it around, making meaning through two languages, making meaning with the pictures as well, the multimodality. So all, these are all the things that we're doing with the teachers. With this other one, I'd just like to, I'll show it to you and then talk about it.
Chinese New Year by Tony. 中国新年 Chinese people like to celebrate Chinese New Year. 中国人喜欢春节. The Chinese New Year comes between January and February every year. 中国春节在每年的1月和2月. There are crowds of people.
I'll stop there. So this one, you can see that the Chinese characters are being used, which is great. And there's been a bit of help from parents there. And it's really nice. You can hear that Tony, the kid, he's reading, and he's actually more confident with reading the English than he is with reading the Chinese, which is great for, you know, the promotion of the home language literacy and you know, trying to help out with that, trying to help learning. Okay, so the significance of promoting multiliteracies through translanguaging pedagogy. So going back to that idea of translanguaging with those goals of increasing, co-constructing knowledge, supporting multilingual identities, all of these kinds of goals, it can really help, with promoting multiliteracies, because if you think about increasing students' linguistic repertoire, if you think that, translanguaging is about increasing students' linguistic repertoire as well as leveraging it, then you can promote home language literacies under the umbrella of multiliteracies. And multiliteracies, I think it's very important to think about it in terms of multiliteracies, because the multimodality helps so much. If you just focus on the home language literacies without thinking about, the sound functions, and without thinking about, making meaning in different ways, it can be very difficult for the kids because they might not be very confident with it. So it's all these tools, using all these tools to help them, to help promote the home language literacy practices. It's also really useful, we've found, for increasing language awareness of teachers, which they can then pass on to the students. So this noticing of similarities and differences between home languages, English, between different home languages as well. It really helps the students understand. And if you do think, as I do, that increasing the linguistic repertoire as an end in itself is important, then students get to learn all about the home language practices of other students in the class, which is a really great learning curve for them. Giving an active role to MEAs and families is a very affirming thing for the students. The affordances of digital multimodality, we found them to be very motivational, and not motivational just for the students, but also for the teachers. The teachers really enjoyed it. And that student engagement was clear, that they really, the feedback that students gave in their student reflections, and I haven't really had time to talk about that today, but they mentioned home language. They weren't just talking about their English. They said that they were learning more about, they enjoyed learning more about their home language, how to read and write, and also expanding their vocabulary in their home language, this kind of thing. So it's a really, I think it can be very successful. It can be hard work in the sense that, as I said before, because the societal thing about English being completely taken for granted, just convincing teachers or schools that it's a priority for them is perhaps the hardest thing. And once you've convinced them that it is really useful and it's going to be great for the kids, then it gets easier from there on in. But it is hard to convince people that it's a priority. And thank you very much for listening. That's it from me.